My name is Francille Rusan Wilson, and I was born in St. Louis, Missouri, in St. Mary's Hospital, and actually People's Hospital, now that I think about it a little bit more, on March 7th, 1947. I'm 75 years old.
Okay, very good. I'd like to begin, if you don't mind, with your childhood, and explain about your family. Exactly how far back you want to go is up to you, but definitely your grandparents, your parents, and let's start talking about that time.
Okay, my parents, Thomas Rusan and Georgia Talia Rusan. My father was born in St. Louis County, Missouri, and he's from a family that had lived in Missouri. I'm not sure how far back, but at least into the 1860s. And I haven't been able to figure out whether the Rusans were enslaved or whether they were freed right after the Civil War. Missouri was a slave state that was not in the, didn't join the Confederacy, but fought. My great-grandfather, Frank Rusan, homesteaded land in Franklin County, Missouri, which is about 50 miles southeast of St. Louis, and he got the deed in the early 1890s. I'm not sure, at some point, either I or my sons are gonna look and see, I've looked at the census, and I know he was in Franklin County in the 1870s. It's very difficult to trace in the official records before that. He married a woman named Julia Burrill, and they were married for some time. My grandfather grew up on this farm, but it wasn't a very successful farm. And this area that they lived in was had been in some ways a Confederate stronghold. In other ways, it was a French and German Catholic place. So when I look at the census for people, there are a lot of people that say French born in Canada, and I don't even understand. I mean, I understand that in a way, and then some say French born in Missouri. And so that I really don't understand. But initially, the Rusans were Catholic. As time went on, many of them, and when my grandfather was the youngest, Thomas, he married a woman, Mildred Bivens, and she was a Baptist, and so my grandfather became a Baptist as well. And they eventually, and most of my grandfather's relatives eventually moved into St. Louis County, which is now like a suburb of St. Louis, but then it wasn't exactly a suburb. And they bought or built a house in the black section of what a city called Richmond Heights. And I learned from my aunt that they didn't have an indoor toilet until they were in high school in the late 30s. And that wasn't really all that unusual. I can remember as a small girl when my grandmother pressed the city government to get our street paved. And in general, the black part of town, the streets weren't paved, whereas the white part of town, the streets were paved. I will say that for the most part, Richmond Heights, when I was growing up, was more of a working class, both blacks and whites. They worked at a small steel mill. I think my grandfather worked at a brickyard during the Depression. And my grandfather and grandmother were both working class. And on my mother's side, my mother grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas. And her parents were separated. Her father, Victor Tallier, lived in St. Louis and was a hod carrier, which is a person that carries, a hod is I guess like almost like a metal platform that carries bricks. So it's both a skilled and a laborer job. He had a decent job. I know about the hod carrier from the census, but later he got a better job that had benefits. And it seems to me that all four of my grandparents were fortunate enough to have jobs during the Depression. And they took great pride in owning their own homes. My grandmother, Alma Tallier, had 3 children. My mother was the middle child. And her oldest child was about 15 years older than my mother. And like most black parents at the time, my 4 grandparents really sacrificed to send their own children to college. They had, I don't think any of them had finished high school. So it was a typical kind of thing in the community that people wanted to see their children do better than they did. So in the case of my father's parents, they sent my father's oldest sister, both my parents were middle children. They sent my father and his older sister to Sumner High School, which was in the city and which required several bus tokens and changes, because there was only one high school for black people in all of St. Louis County, no buses, no nothing. And although it wasn't a bad school, Sumner was one of the best schools in really high schools in the country, and its teachers had PhDs and other things, and that made a gigantic difference for my father and his sister.
It was white and black?
No, everything
Sumner
was segregated.
Was segregated,
and
yes.
it was named after Charles Sumner, who was an Massachusetts abolitionist senator. And so, like, the black high schools in the United States typically were named after, if they were named after whites, they were abolitionists, or they were named after black heroes. Frederick Douglass, that was the name of the other high school in St. Louis County. There was another one in the city named that was called Vashon, that was named after a black abolitionist and leader. And my parents actually, when I was about 8, built a house next door to a woman who was the granddaughter of Vashon. And so, but other schools were named, Wheatley. They were just named after Phyllis Wheatley, named after Booker T. Washington, different kind of heroes.
So it's all segregated. But you mentioned this high school that had a very good reputation.
It had a very good reputation.
There were PhDs
yes.
that were teaching. And it was, again, we're talking all African American.
All African American, okay. All African American teachers. One of the reasons is most of the historically black colleges, which at the time were just these segregated colleges, whether they were state or private, whites could attend the colleges, but blacks couldn't attend white colleges in Missouri, particularly state colleges. In some places like Kentucky, it was illegal for black people to go to, black and whites to go to the same college, even if the college was private. They passed laws in the early 20th century. So because all of the black colleges were in either rural or more remote places, some black people decided, who wanted to live in a city, then they ended up teaching in high schools. And in some cases, the high school salaries were about the same as the college salaries. In Missouri, there was a black college that both of my parents went to, Lincoln University, that had been founded by Civil War, a black Civil War regiment. And Jefferson City is about 120 miles from St. Louis. It's the capital of Missouri, and that's where that college, and it had amazing professors as well that my parents always talked about.
So your parents went to?
Both of my parents went to. They met at Lincoln University. They both had transferred. My father had gone to University of Illinois, which was integrated. Both my parents graduated from high school in 1938, and they spent a year or so my mother had gone to a community college that was also segregated, and I think it was actually an extension of her high school. And then they transferred and met each other at Lincoln.
Okay. So what were, growing up as a child, what do you remember about your parents, your surroundings, your neighborhood? Could you tell us a little bit about that? Especially this working class element.
Well, my parents were very gregarious, especially my dad. My mother was a little bit more reserved. And what I do remember is initially we lived on the street, Argus Street, that my father's mother had gotten the road paved. When I hear people say they didn't know they were poor, the historian in me kind of wonders about that. But when I think about growing up on this street and with shotgun houses, we didn't think we were poor. And so I've come to understand that notion. Initially, we lived in a house that next door to my grandparents, and it was like, well, today we would call it a duplex, but it was really a shotgun apartment is an apartment that really doesn't have any halls. It's called shotgun because you could shoot a shotgun through the front. So it had a front room, which we call a front room instead of a living room, a bedroom, and then the kitchen. And my father's sister lived on, and her two sons lived on the other side. And my grandparents owned that house as well as that duplex, as well as their house next door. And then a little bit later, we moved to the other side of my grandparents to a house that we call the Roush house, and the Roushes had moved to California. This is by this time, this is probably the early 50s, very early 50s, so I'm 3 or 4. And they had a big house. The houses on the street, which had been built by people from the beginning of the World War I, varied. Some of them were little, some of them, this is a big 2-story house. Well, my father had established a practice in a nearby town, Webster Groves, which also a lot of
What was your father's?
My father became a physician.
Where?
And
I'm sorry, where did he go to medical school?
he went to Meharry College Medical School in Nashville, Tennessee. And both my parents graduated from Lincoln in 1942. This is just as the U.S. is
receiving a college degree.
They received their college degrees. My mother won a scholarship to attend Columbia School of Social Work, and my father was admitted to Meharry Medical College.
And this is Columbia where?
Columbia in New York.
New York, okay.
Columbia University School of Social Work. And they eloped. I think my mother's scholarship may have required her, she never has said this, but may have required her to be single. So I think they kept things a little bit under wraps so she could get the scholarship. I mean, the family knew. I think officially she was still Georgia Tallier. She went to New York, moved in, lived with her older sister, who was there with her husband and 2 sons, lived in Harlem, had stories about the blackouts, and also how Columbia made her take some courses at Hunter College to prove that she could get in, even though my mother would always say she had never gotten anything less than an A.
So they forced her to take courses
just to prove that she could
because she was black.
Because she was black, and you know, there was a feeling that the black colleges weren't as good. Well, I don't know if you know this, but during the Second World War, the Army took over all the medical schools in the United States, or at least most of them. And so my father, who had worked his way through Lincoln University, working in the summers on railroad dining cars, he admit that my father didn't have to pay tuition. All the men, I don't know whether the women had to pay tuition, all the men were inducted in the Army. And actually now I don't know what happened if you weren't a citizen. There were you know, British subjects and Caribbean people. It was one of several segregated medical schools at the time. So the good news was that my father was admitted into the Army. His tuition and other things were paid, but it also meant that the medical schools ran year round. But that turned out to be good because he graduated in 3 years. And when he graduated in the summer of 1945, the war was over. And my father was determined not to serve much longer. Most of his classmates ended up fulfilling their responsibilities by going to Germany or Japan. But my father fought for years to have his responsibilities be to the poor community that he was serving in Missouri. And after my mom died in 2018, I discovered all these letters that his patients sent to the Army, because they kept making the draft kept telling my father he had to re-enlist. And I think one of the consequences was he got knocked down to private, but our family never went to Europe or, I don't know if my father served in the reserves, but I have these letters over the years. I have some memory of that. When my mother finished Columbia School of Social Work, it's a 2-year course, and got her master's in social work, she moved first to Nashville and then joined my dad in St. Louis. So
they decided to come back.
They come back to my father's home. As I said, we live near my grandparents, and my father wanted to build what we would now call a mid-century modern home, but what then he thought of as a ranch house, a brick ranch house. Missouri is known for its brick. And so he didn't really want to leave the community, so he found a Jewish architect and builder to buy a plot of land that was exactly 2 blocks from where his parents lived. But that 2 blocks made that plot on an invisible dividing line between the black and white part of town. This is why the the builder had to buy it. It's what we called a straw buyer. And when the city realized that a black person had built and moved into this house, they tried to seize the property through eminent domain and had a bond issue, which my parents and grandparents and the community fought. And so we lived in that house for about 5 years, and then the Federal Highway 40 came through and took that property. I don't know if the city of Richmond Heights rooted it that way, but it actually the highway took quite a bit of property. My parents actually sold the house to a fellow black physician, who moved the house a block or 2 up the same street. And my parents moved also a block or 2, but on a slightly different street, and developed that area as a place where black professionals could build modern homes. And
they were left alone by the...
Well, by then, that just changed where the dividing line was.
Okay.
But I grew up living first across the street, and then still 3 blocks away from the white school, but having to attend Lincoln Elementary School and walk about 10 blocks to the black school. And even after 1954, the school district did not desegregate. They started desegregating backwards in about the 1960s. And so first the high school was desegregated, then 4 years later the middle school. So I went to an integrated middle school and the local high school.
What was that like?
It was weird because we knew that we had gotten, if not an inferior education, we certainly had inferior books, because when we got our books, the white children had clearly had those books like for 10 years. You know, there were all these names in them, and they were old books. In 6th grade, we had about 15 or 20 kids in our class. We only got 3 math books. And so as a kid, I was terrified about what it would be like to be in, it was junior high then, junior high, without having, all of the kind of support. We had supportive teachers, but...
In this integrated school?
Well, we have supported teachers in our segregated school. In the integrated school, it was kind of catch as catch can. It was, what do you call it? There were different, I'm blanking on the word. The classes were segregated by ability. So most of the black kids were put in lower ability classes. They weren't exactly special ed, but there was only one class that was, you know, for like the accelerated. Then there was then there was a music class. All of these things had alphabetical letters. So 7C and 8C were the accelerated for whatever reason. The music was M. I think there was a special ed tracking, is what we called it, and what it's still called. And so I remember my teacher being maybe inadvertently racist. She, you know, at one point we were talking about geography, and she used instead of saying Nigeria, she used the N word and put IA, RIA, which I knew was, you know, wrong. And, you know, did she do that on purpose? Was that ignorant? I mean, you know, like, what's going on here? So you felt a little, there wasn't the kind, we had so much attention from our own teachers that the lack of attention, it didn't have to be necessarily mean. And for me, in the track that I was in, there were only 2 black kids. So you
were in the higher track? In the higher track.
And the other student had, his parents were teachers. And so, you know, it's sort of like they understood that those parents would be pressing and would be paying more attention than the working class parents who might not realize that what kind of heavy tracking there were. But we knew that, you know, that the other kids were smart and, you know, they could have been in these tracks. So it was I think, probably awkward for both sides. In junior high and high school, kids were friendly, but if you saw them outside of class, they, you know, like at the mall or something, they wouldn't speak. And so, you know, there was no doubt that they were either told by their parents, maybe I can think of 2 or 3 times that I was ever invited to anybody's house. You know, for even, you know, like if student council or something was having something, you weren't really invited to people's homes.
Were there any incidences at school among the 2 groups?
Yes, in high school. I don't remember incidents in junior high, but in high school, sometimes there would be altercations or fights. But on the other hand, if we were playing basketball, or there was a black guy that was a state level wrestler, if we were doing something as a school, then black people and white people would fight together the other school, you know. So the high school that I went to was a largely working class high school. So, you know, it was something like out of, I don't know if you've ever seen this thing, Happy Days with the Fonz, you know, where kids wore, you know, the pompadours, and, you know, there was, the dress code was, for boys, was that you must wear a shirt. You know, like it was, you know, it was. And so I would say that some of the white kids were, you know, disruptive as well. You know, one white kid that was a wrestler got angry, and I actually saw this at the biology teacher who was also the football coach, and literally picked him up in a chair and dropped him out the window. The coach wasn't hurt, but it was a big statement. So, you know, there was a lot of kind of class things that were going on. There were, to my knowledge, only 2 Jewish students in the school. You know, it was not just, you know, I wasn't exposed at that time to a wide range of people. It was much more black and white. And, you know, I think the Jewish students felt somewhat, you know, isolated. They weren't segregated against, but, you know, it was always pointed out that this person was Jewish, and I became friends with one of the Jewish student in my class, and I think she felt particularly vulnerable because her mother was Mexican, and you know, so that was a little bit different.
It sounds like the racism was quite subtle, meaning it wasn't overt. Am I exaggerating?
There were some subtleties. You got called the N-word. When we first moved, I guess I was 5, and I remember standing outside, and the kids, this is before the highway, so this is the house, and there were whites in the block parallel to me, and those houses looked a lot like my grandparents' houses. And so everything past that block was black. So they were, you know, kind of isolated. I think the city was trying to make that the street from what was Dale Avenue north, I think they were trying to make that a white block. So when we moved, it meant that this one white block was more isolated, and we had this newer house. Across from us were more ranch-style houses that whites lived, and the white children and those, you know, who are roughly my age, they were screaming N-words at us. And eventually, or I don't know, in the next year or so, all the whites that lived across the street moved. And black people began to buy those houses. Now, behind us and further up the street that we were on, which was called Laclede Station Road, that was all vacant land. So when my parents developed that area, they were building, you know, people were building new homes on, it was plotted out, but the streets didn't. The streets hadn't been built yet, the other streets.
So your parents had a large role to play in
terms
of developing this neighborhood.
They did. They did. It was their both dream, but also the city made them pay for all of the utilities, sewer, gas, electric, to come into the new street.
They had to pay for that
They
themselves.
had to pay for that.
The city would not.
The city did not. And I don't know what they did to other things, but I found again, when my mom died, I knew that they had to pay, but I found that they had to pay an additional $10,000, and this is like in the late 50s. This is a lot of money to bring not just to their house, but like halfway down the street. So this benefited the people who would build their homes next.
So they really helped the community thrive.
They did. And in 2018, there was a little mini park at the corner of the two streets, which told the story of my parents, but also one of the people that built a house was my father's high school tennis coach. And in sort of the mid-60s, maybe, I don't know if it's 63 or something, because he was a coach in the black tennis circuit, he brought a young man from Richmond who couldn't play junior tennis in Virginia, Arthur Ashe.
Oh my goodness.
He built a tennis court, a clay tennis court, and Arthur Ashe could play junior tennis in Missouri. Missouri's segregation was a little different from the South. Schools were segregated, but buses were not segregated. The libraries weren't segregated. The parks, the public parks, for the most part, weren't segregated. Amusement parks were segregated. The tourist showboats and things that went up and down the Mississippi were segregated. If you wanted to go to the amusement park, you had to wait until a black school district rented the whole park, and you know that would be like before the summer started, to attend the thing. The same with the Admiral, which was a fake steamboat. To ride on the Admiral, you know, a black fraternity or group had to rent the whole boat. You couldn't just buy a ticket in those days and go on. So it was, you know, it was not as cut and dry as further south, but there was still, there were places you couldn't eat. And in the city, the county, you know, like you couldn't, there were some restaurants you could get carry out, but not, or, you know, when they had those restaurants that you, with car hops, and you have a, you know, you speak into something. They had some that you could actually sit in your car and eat, but you couldn't go into the restaurant. And my dad was always pressing the borders of what that was. So sometimes we would go to a restaurant, he would demand to be served. Sometimes we would be served, other times we'd be set. You know, that we'd have to wait for, we'd be seated, but you'd have to wait for an hour before somebody took your thing, or you would be seated at a, you know, next to the kitchen or something. So there would be always a big discussion about that.
But your father really pushed.
He pushed.
He pushed the boundaries.
He was always pushing the boundaries.
Interesting.
That was something he did.
How was it for you to experience those moments?
Sometimes it was scary, you know, like, because he would get into an argument and you're like, oh, can't we just go home? But I admired him for pushing the boundaries. And when we traveled, he would always, we were auto club members. So if we were taking a long car trip, he would always call ahead and get the reservation. And if they hesitated when we showed up, he would always say, I'm going to report you to the auto club and they'll take you out of the book. So we rarely had any trouble. The only time I remember us having trouble on a car trip was ironically in Vermont. And the people came in the middle of the night after we checked in and were demanding that we leave. That was very upsetting.
Owners?
The owners.
Wow.
I don't know what exactly happened, but my father stood his ground, but we left the next day. So they
came in the middle of the night when you were all...
Yeah, I don't know if someone that wasn't the owner checked us in.
I see.
But my father was always very careful to, you know, like stop, and in those days there were actually telephone, you know, booths, and call and say, I'm auto club member, blah, 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 and get the reservation. So that not just, because if he feared, if you just show up, they'll say there's actually no vacancy. So he wouldn't just stop.
What was it like traveling up north as an African American family?
When we traveled in the South, we stayed with relatives, and we pretty much only traveled in the South to go to funerals. And my father was really clear that he was not that interested in, you know, any kind of vacation in the South. And my mother's mother would come and stay with us for a couple of months, and then she would stay with her daughter in New York. So we mainly did vacations in the North or Midwest, and we did a lot of vacations that were trips to National Medical Association meetings. They had a children's program. My parents were like a lot of black parents. They, even going north, you know, you packed a big set of food so, you know, you would avoid situations where you did, you know, where people wouldn't serve you, especially going through places like Indiana where you weren't really sure. It's Midwest, but not unsegregated. My parents would drive. They liked to drive, and they would drive straight through, taking turns to New York.
From Missouri?
From Missouri.
Wow.
It's about 24 hours. And today I can sort of think, okay, they probably did this because they didn't want to have to figure out if they could stay at a hotel or something. So we went to New York. We stayed at, my father liked to stay, preferred to stay at hotels rather than relatives, and I certainly benefited from that. I think we took, when I was a teenager, we went to Martha's Vineyard. I don't know that we drove when I was a teenager. I know once when I was in college, my dad and I, you could have a car in college when you were a junior. And my dad and I drove to Massachusetts and drove to Martha's Vineyard, where I was going to be a part of writing for a show, what was called Junior Show. So I do remember that was a great trip, you know, just me and my father. And he must have flown back since, you know, we were driving what became my car, and you know.
What were you writing for?
Well, at the time, I don't think they do this anymore. At the time, at Wellesley, there was
Wellesley College.
Wellesley College. There was a juniors put on a play. It was called Junior Show. And it had one of the features of the play was it developed the class song. And so then you would teach, you were a junior, you would teach your freshman little sisters the song. But it was a play. It's something like Wellesley College's version of the Hasty Pudding Show. And you wrote the play over the summer and then had tryouts. And, you know, so my dad, that's why my dad dropped me off in the Vineyard, because somebody had a place there, and we were, the group that was writing for Junior Show went to
Somebody
the Vineyard.
Meaning?
A classmate.
A classmate, okay, very nice. So I just want to stay a little bit more with your parents. Basically, you grew up in a family which they were the leaders of the community. May I put it that way? Or
they were among the leaders. I think my father had an older cousin, Walter, who was a school teacher. I think
Walter who?
Walter Roussan.
Okay.
And I think he was very much a leader in Webster Groves, the adjoining city, and he was an amazing role model to my dad. As I said, my grandfather was the youngest of about 10 kids. So there were, you know, Walter, who was maybe 10 years older than my father, was you know, one of the first in the Roussan family to have a college education, and he was a very, very well respected. I think my father, being a doctor and pretty much coming back to his own community, made him very respected. Later, when I was in high school, my mother joined the poverty program. She had worked as a social worker before I was born, then stopped working for a little while, and then she joined the poverty program and worked in the county, and that gave her, you know, sort of really improving situations for people. And then later she was in the poverty program, which was called Human Development Corporation in St. Louis, and was one of the division heads. So yes, they were a part of a community that had a number of activists. So I don't think they were the most militant, but they were in the NAACP and other organizations.
Wonderful. So you mentioned, was it your grandfather who worked in the railroad, in the dining car?
Yeah, my father.
Your father. Can you say a little bit about trains, railroad, and African American? There's a connection there.
Absolutely. I think there's a connection both in terms of the railroad being a way to go north and then to visit. My grandmother would come on, you know, there were these various eagles. There was a Texas eagle, and I don't know if there was.
Where was your grandmother?
My grandmother was in Little Rock.
Ah.
My mother's mother.
Yes.
So she would come on the train. It was also a source of middle-class employment for men who became Pullman car porters. And very often, I know that Patricia Roberts, who became the first black woman to be join the president's cabinet, and she was head of Housing and Urban Development. Her father was a Pullman porter. It was a job that, on the one hand, could be seen as demeaning because white passengers called every Pullman porter George. And literally, there's a book called, 5,000 Men Named George. And George was the name of George Pullman, who created these sleeping cars, so the sleeping car porters. But during the Depression, with the Labor Relations Boards Act, the Pullman porters were the largest black union in the country. And so they had bargaining power, they had regular wages. The Pullman porters were both, it was a job that conferred middle-class standing within the black community because you had regular wages, but it was also a job for men that had a demeaning aspect in that all the black Pullman car porters were called George, and they were only black porters. There were some maids that were black and Filipino, and they were called George because George Pullman had created the sleeping cars. So he also created an all-white town that was called Pullman, Illinois. So right next to Chicago, and maybe part of Chicago today. So,
but George Pullman was white.
George Pullman was white and was, in today's terms, he would have been a billionaire because he created these sleeping cars, and then the sleeping cars were put on railroad cars, so they were specially designed. That I don't know if you've ever been on one of these trains. So you're sitting, it has seats during the day, and they pull down to beds, and the Pullman porters brought you your food, took care of your bags, and also on the train were dining car waiters and cooks, And many black college students worked in the summers on these trains to help pay their tuition. There were other things that they did. They made work in resorts across, like in New York and Michigan and other places. My dad worked on a line that went, I don't know if it went from Chicago or St. Louis to Colorado Springs. And the Colorado Springs was one of the turnaround places. And he stayed in a rooming house that a black family had for porters and workers. And so one of my godparents, actually, Gracie Lee Garner, was from a family that the family that owned one of these boarding houses. And when she married and moved to St. Louis, shortly before I was born, she became one of my godparents. So it was a way to see the country. My parents loved Colorado as a result of that. They had some friends that had, from Richmond Heights, that had moved to Colorado as a place that was more open and less segregated. And so as a child, we often went to Denver and, you know, Pikes Peak and other places in Colorado, as well as, you know, our trips to the East Coast.
So, so it seems like railroads became an open opportunity.
Absolutely. Right. Many of the blues songs talk about the railroads and you know, leaving the past behind, and you know, was an avenue to, you know, going to Chicago, going to Kansas City. All of those things were on the railroads.
Okay. So now I'd like to, if you could speak about your finishing high school and what happened after that. Where did you go to college? And
okay, I finished Maplewood Richmond Heights High School, 1965, shortly after Selma and other kinds of things. Selma, the Bloody Sunday, was actually my 18th birthday, and I really wanted to go with the buses, the protesters from St. Louis who were going to make the final Selma to Montgomery march, but my parents feared that there would be problems, and so they wouldn't let me go. My parents were anxious in 1965 that I, you know, go to a college that I might, you know, the best college that I might want to attend. My advisors weren't that particular. People at my college did not typically went to University of Missouri. They might go to Drake, which I think is in Iowa. The majority of people at my high school did not, black and white, did not go to college. So I wasn't really encouraged by my advisors, but my parents encouraged me to look at different colleges, and so I had looked at Wellesley and fallen in love with it, and you know, didn't really think about what other options there would be. I had looked at Fisk University, which a lot of my friends were attending, and I actually thought that that was going to, in some ways, be a lot. I was impressed with how people were dressing and, you know, wearing cashmere sweaters and trimmed with mink to football games, and that wasn't something at the time that I thought I could compete with those girls from Chicago and Detroit. And Wellesley, it's about 15 miles from Boston. Just a beautiful campus with a lake. And I just fell in love with it and implied early decision and got in. And
So you visited?
We visited.
With your dad?
With my both parents.
Your parents, okay.
And I just fell in love with it. And I knew about the Seven Sisters, but I didn't have, I mean, I didn't want to be in Western Massachusetts. I felt like that was going to be too far.
The Seven Sisters.
The Seven Sisters were, at the time, all women's colleges that were, some of them were were physically associated with Ivy League schools. So there was Radcliffe, which shared a campus with Harvard, and you took classes with Harvard, but you got a Radcliffe degree in those days. There was Smith, Mount Holyoke. Those were in Western Massachusetts. There was Vassar in New York. There was, not Providence College, there was a college that was associated with Brown. It could have been Providence.
Yeah.
And there was Bryn Mawr in Pennsylvania. And there was a college associated with Rutgers. I'm blanking on that name. So there were 7. Oh, Barnard.
Ah, yeah, Barnard.
Maybe that gets to 7, and which was associated with Columbia. But you also got a Barnard degree. I think Barnard still is a female-only. Radcliffe doesn't exist as an undergraduate college anymore. And also all of the male colleges that the Ivies were pretty much all male except for Penn and University of Pennsylvania and Cornell. So Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth were all, Brown, were all male. So choosing an all-women's college wasn't as unusual. And I knew that I would be, if I chose Wellesley, I would be close to Boston College, Boston University, Harvard. You know, I would not be completely away from men.
What was the application process like?
You know, I don't remember that much about it. You took the SATs. I can't honestly remember I remember my SAT scores, but I don't remember whether we had to take the advanced courses. And honestly, I didn't think a lot about it until I got there and realized there were only 6 black students in my class. One of whom I had grown up with in St. Louis. We were all middle-class girls, mostly there was one person from Chicago, one person from Houston, the 2 of us from St. Louis, one person from New Orleans, and one person from Norfolk, Virginia. And so we were mostly Southern girls coming to Wellesley in 1965 when people still packed white gloves to go to church. And, but in my mind, I'm going to the place where Charles Sumner and, the other famous abolitionists have come from. So I'm thinking I'm coming to a place that is really much more open and has more possibilities. It's 1 year after the Civil Rights Act. And so I'm surprised, number one, that there's only 6 of us, and there was only 1 sophomore, no juniors, and 3 black seniors. And so I didn't think I knew it wasn't going to be a lot of black people, but I didn't realize how few there actually were going to be. But my greatest surprise was that we were all room with each other, and except for me. And I had a Jewish roommate, and I later discovered that they had asked her parents if they would be willing to be part of an experiment, but they hadn't asked my parents anything. And her name was Susan Leibowitz, and she became an oncologist. She was very determined to finish college in 3 years so she could get on, because the medical degree was going to take so much longer. We were fine as roommates, but I came to realize that the reason we were chosen as roommates was that one of the 6 of us had asked for a single room. So that disrupted their carefully laid out plans to put
Together.
the black students. We weren't all in the same dorm, but to put us together. So what they did was they put my classmate Nancy Gist almost directly below me in the same in the same dorm, so that was really a shock to realize. And as we began to explore this more, we realized that they actually room Jewish students together, the Lutherans together, you know, Presbyterians together, that they had, you know, what seemed to us to be a very offensive way of choosing how roommates were chosen. They didn't say, you know, what kind of things do you like? You know, what do you want? So this was the beginning of my own political, both awakening and activism. And we began to write letters to the administration, and some of us had won scholarships, what's called NSFNS, National Scholarship Service Fund. I can't remember what it stood for, but it turned out that one of the heads of it was a Wellesley grad. And when we wrote her about this housing situation, she became very upset and, you know, communicated that to the administration. So they said the next year would be different. The next year, 11 black students, I don't know how many were admitted, but 11 came. They put all of them in single rooms. So this wasn't exactly what we planned. So after a trip to Columbia University, a conference for black students, we decided we needed a black student organization, and we created an organization called Ethos and began to press the college for things that we thought we needed. More black students, there were no black faculty. There was
no black faculty when you went.
No black faculty when I went. There actually weren't even black service workers. This is being Massachusetts. Virtually all the service workers were Irish. And you know, I began to see there were some subtle and not so subtle class differences. So I think that the working class Irish students that were admitted to Wellesley felt as out of place in different kinds of ways than as we did. I would say half of the students, maybe not quite half, certainly over a third of the students had gone to very elite prep schools. And so even somebody like Hillary Rodham, who was in my class, had gone to a elite public high school, but you know, the students that had gone to these elite private boarding schools, they were in a completely different league. You know, they vacationed in Europe and South Africa and other kinds of things. They were very wealthy. So that was a very different experience for me. So I think, but I came to see that others, other students, I had a friend classmate across the hall from me that had come from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And, so in another person that had come from Wyoming, Pennsylvania. And, so what we were experiencing, some of this was the difference in the vast difference in class differences, and people were either sensitive or not sensitive. There was also a difference in the kinds of jobs that everybody, this is New England, everybody had to have a job. It's a very New England thing. But the kinds of jobs that scholarship students had were a little different. And so you could tell that this person was a scholarship person. My father was insistent that I not have a scholarship. He did not want me to feel different. It's interesting, Wellesley costs, I don't know when I started, I think it was $2,800 a year. When I left, it was about $4,500 a year. Now it's, with tuition, room, and board, it's closer to $60. It wasn't a small amount then. And, if we look at what those dollars were, but it was much more manageable than certainly these private schools are today.
So, so you didn't take a scholarship. You worked.
Yeah, everybody worked. Everybody had some kind of job, answering the telephones, doing
something. What was your
job? I think I had to answer the phone at certain times. Again, no cell phones. So if somebody came, we had a system that was called bells, and so somebody came to visit. You had a caller that was a male, or a visitor that was somebody from the other door, and so people had to be announced. Men could only come into your room on Sunday afternoon after the Sunday dinner was like more. We only had 2 meals on Sunday, and there had sort of from 2 to 5 or something, and the door had to be open, and there had to be 3 feet on the floor at all times. So this is what we started. By the time we ended, by the time 1969 came about, there were all those rules. Most of those rules were gone. And men could come on other day, visit you in your room on other days than Sunday afternoon, and
So, I think you're being a little humble, but would you talk about your own scholarship and your own achievements in that regard? And what was it like? Did you ever feel at Wellesley? They were obvious with your roommate, and those movements were not exactly unsensitive, but did you feel prejudice here and there? What was it like?
I don't think I felt direct prejudice. The thing that helped me the most, I felt like I did feel that the administration, especially when we first came in, was from a different era. Than us girls. This wasn't a racial thing, and so we had rules at Wellesley that were much more rigid than the vast majority of us had growing up. And You know, it wasn't like our parents were loose or anything. So that was a cause of tension. You know, everything was changing in terms of the country. The thing that helped me the most was that I was told by one of the deans, and I think most of us were told this, that we were going to experience that the boarding school girls were going to do better than us for the first year, and then we would catch up. And we were told, and I don't think this is happening at Wellesley anymore, we were told that we were all had the same ability. We were all smart, and there was a reason we were chosen, and that things would get better. And they didn't actually count the first year's grades in honors. So, and some of those things I think have changed over time. And I think for me, that meant that the difficulties that I had in the first year, I had been given the impression that they would not be forever. So I did feel that I didn't get this culture of poverty thing starting from the beginning. Now later, as we got more active, one of the deans said in a public meeting that all the black students had come from places where their parents weren't educated and they only had comic books to read. You know, and for almost all of us, at least one of our parents not only had a college degree, but had an advanced degree. So actually this is maybe my junior year that this happened. So all the black students got up and walked out when
This was said openly.
This was an all college meeting because we were protesting, you know, the lack of black students and, you know, the insensitivities of the university. But initially when I came in, I felt that I was sort of lumped in, for good or ill, with the public school students. And, you know, what we were told was that, you know, the private school students had just had a better education than we did, but we would catch up with them. So I felt like my lacks had to do with public school. And that was pretty clear. You know, I had biology and maybe chemistry from the football coach, which I later learned didn't really know very much about those areas, and so didn't help me. I had a French teacher that only taught 2 tenses of French, even though I had A's for 4 years. And I was shocked to realize that there were other tenses in French, you know, like we never learned the subjunctive, we didn't even learn the future. She would lower the curtains and turn on Edith Piaf. So later I realized, you know, I think Madam so-and-so was an alcoholic. So when I get to college, I'm taking French 3. I should have been in French 0, but I didn't realize that I even had the right to say, let me start over with French. So we're reading Ionesco. I mean, I didn't even know there were, you know, I just knew the present and the passé composé. You know, so this is a horrendous experience. And of course, everybody is making fun of my Southern accent and French. So, but this wasn't racial. Do you know what I mean? Yes. I didn't understand it as racial. Yeah. I understood it as, oh boy, have I been fooled about this? So I think for the most part, I really experienced very positive things from my professors, and only one professor who'd come in from South Africa had, you know, said really problematic things in class. And by that time, I was, you know, I was not reticent, and, you know, I challenged.
Problematic, probably.
Well, he was teaching sociology, and he said everything I know about race in the U.S. I've learned from Time magazine, and, you know, he would just say, he made all kinds of assumptions about black people that he didn't have a problem with sharing. And I really resented it, to the point that I only took, in the final, he asked some question, and I just said, "You're asking me to defend my existence. I'm not going to do it." I still got an A, but, you know, years later I met him and I said, you know, you're very problematic as a professor. I don't know if he changed his tune.
But you walked out.
When
they said that you...
we all walked out when
they said that African-American families only read
comic books.
And all of you walked out?
All, I think, except one.
And then what happened?
She took up, she stayed to defend, us. But it was, you know, and it also meant that there was another just all student meeting that was held, and that the students decided that they were going to put money into recruiting more black students, and they actually gave us funds to recruit through the South. And myself and a classmate, the person in the class below me, Francille Guy, we went to Arkansas, we went to Tennessee, we went to Alabama. That was really scary. And when we were in Alabama, must be 1968.
So you went there to recruit students.
We went there and
we
talked to students about coming to Wellesley.
Let's hear about Alabama.
So we get to we went to Montgomery, and we're talking to students, and Wellesley just seems impossibly far away. They're thinking about going to Tuskegee, and for them, going north is to go to Howard, which is fine, but, you know, like, we're telling them we're going to go 500, 600 miles further, and it's going to be mostly white girls. You know, they're like, what? And we are, and plus, we have afros and mini skirts. So we're just standing out in both the black and the white areas. And cabs had been segregated, but they were just beginning to be desegregated. And I have to say, I did not feel comfortable in the white cab. You know, I'm feeling nervous. I don't know where the airport is. We get to the airport, we're sitting there, and Francine decides to go to get a newspaper or a magazine, and she goes and she comes back, and then I go because we have our bags. And when I come into the little, you know, store to get the newspaper, it's one of the southern airports where you're half outside, you know, and the guy at the counter says, "My God, there's another one." We're like, I'm like, oh, stranger in town, we need to get, how soon can we get out of here? You know, I mean, you know, looking back, I'm thinking, here I am, I have this wool plaid mini skirt on, you know, and we both have big afros. you
You
know.
were at Wellesley College. I mean, you know.
And even though we're from the South, we clearly had forgotten. She was from Memphis, and we had gone to Nashville. It was just before Thanksgiving, but other people went to, classmates went to different parts of the country. And Wellesley always told us that they admit that the number of students that were admitted had to do with, you know, the actual applications, and that they had generally accepted about 50% of the applicants. So we made sure that they actually got about 200 applications. One student that I have recruited in Washington, D.C. is a judge today. We all, you know, ended up recruiting quite a number of students. And the class that came in, I think it's a class of 74, was the largest class ever, and more students than had ever, you know, more African Americans than had ever attended, like even cumulative.
So you were really quite successful in your activism.
We were successful, and one of the people who was in that class, Karen Grigsley Bates, is an NPR correspondent,
yes.
And you know that class was also just a brilliant class. But I remember I was in graduate school at Harvard at the time, and the administration called me and said, "Can you come out and talk to the girls? They don't smile like you did." And you know, we had just been raised so rigorously to be smiling and polite, and this is 1969, you know, the women's revolution, Black Power revolution, everything is Vietnam. So naturally, these students were not as, you know, sort of, we were just like more trained to be polite, even if we didn't want to be polite, and to smile and do all of those things that these students.
And the political picture had changed.
Yeah, the political picture had changed dramatically.
So then, how did you end up getting married?
Well, in 1968, right after King was assassinated, Ernie and I separately joined a group.
Ernie being
my husband, okay. Ernest Wilson. We joined a group of students and activists who were in cars running around Boston, and particularly the Black community, with ham radio, CB radios, trying to stop potential riots and try to get there before the police and tell people to disperse. This is the night after King died.
Nice. And you're both in Boston?
We were both. He was at Harvard.
He was at Harvard.
And so we did this. We kind of knew each other from parties. I mean, just to say hello. And so after this thing, and Boston did not burn that night, after that thing, I'm driving back to Wellesley, and I see him walking, and I think the buses and trains may have been over. So I asked him for a ride. Asked him if he wanted a ride. And of course, Wellesley and Cambridge weren't exactly in the same direction. But I took him home, and we started dating after that, certainly that next school year. But that was sort of what began this in 1968. And then we dated until he graduated in 1970. I got a master's at Harvard Ed School that same year. And he won a Rockefeller Fellowship to study in Africa. And so we actually broke up for about a year and a half. And I went to Africa while he was still there, but I went to Ghana. I had a cousin that was working in Ghana for Reverend Leon Sullivan had, I think it was called Opportunities Industrial Corporation, that was in the U.S. and had some programs in Africa. And I also was involved with a group of African spiritualist, religious practitioners, and we went on a charter plane, $350 round trip, to Ghana, and were met by all of the traditional religious leaders, and I was living with them in a shrine. Ernie was finishing his Rockefeller year, and he had spent in Zaire, and so he flew up to visit me in Ghana and proposed. And then we traveled a bit throughout Africa, and I think I came back first. He came back. We moved in together in Washington, D.C. We were engaged. My parents were not happy about it, particularly my mother. You know, living together was not the thing. And we got married that June. Ernie had gotten a job as a legislative assistant with Congressman Diggs of Detroit. I was working on cable television and trying to get cable television in the cities and trying to get black people some kind of ownership in cable television franchises that were going to be admitted, and then working for a black consulting firm. And Ernie applied to Berkeley to get a PhD in political science. He was accepted, got a Ford Fellowship, and after we got married, in June, we moved, I guess in August, to Berkeley. And that started our married life.
And then what about you?
I found that there wasn't sort of a lot I could do with the kind of consulting that I'd done. I mean, that everybody wanted it, but nobody wanted to pay for it. So I used some contacts, got some consulting. I taught a community college course. Even though I had a master's of art in teaching from Harvard, I couldn't get a job as a public school teacher because I didn't have the right California credential, but I could get a lifetime credential at community college, which didn't make a lot of sense to me, but I began to do that. And then I applied for what I thought was a part-time job at Mills College, and the then dean was a Holyoke graduate. And so I got hired as head of ethnic studies at Mills College, even though I was not in a PhD program. And that really started my college teaching career. So I was head of a college program before a department before I had a PhD. I thought that meant that they were actually planning for this not to work. But Ernie finished his degree and got his first job at University of Pennsylvania, and I started my graduate program in history at Penn.
What aspect of history?
American history, and with a minor in a subfield in African history. And I hadn't been sure whether I wanted to do history or American studies. At Penn, American studies was then called American civilization. It was more, like material culture, Native Americans, And when I went to talk to, now, mind you, I'm the head of a department at Mills, and by now I have a, you know, I'm an assistant professor. The guy says, we only take 2 black people, this is what he tells me, you only take 2 black people, grad students a year in this program, and I've already accepted 2, and one of them went to Wellesley, so you're out. And but the provost had really, you know, assured me that I would get in the grad program. When I went to talk to the history, head of the history department, they were very encouraging. And so I could see that it was going to be very difficult for me to be in American civilization. I was also pregnant. So this was, you know, I could see that history. I was pregnant, but at the time, they weren't aware that I was pregnant. But I could see that American civilization was going to be a big struggle because this guy had already made it clear that he was keeping a strict quota. Whereas the history person, Richard Dunn, was, you know, just very sympathetic, very encouraging. And so, you know, history became, and I'm not sorry, I'm really happy that I did the history.
So you got your PhD there.
So I got my PhD, I had my first child, Malik, and in Philadelphia, and I got my PhD. We left Penn after about 2.5 years, and so I was working on my PhD from Michigan. And
so you went to the University of Michigan?
Yeah, Ernie got a job at the University of Michigan, so we went to Michigan, and we had, there was a year that we were in Washington. I was doing research on my dissertation. He was working on his first book.
What was your dissertation research?
My dissertation was on early black social scientists and their creation of black labor studies. And it eventually became a book called The Segregated Scholars, Black Social Scientists and the Creation of Labor Studies. So 1890 to 1950.
I'm just going to go back, and we're almost getting to the end. When you mentioned that Dr. King had been assassinated and you and Ernie were trying to calm things down, could you say more about that? Or
yeah. You know, when King was assassinated, everybody was in shock. And I don't remember exactly how I knew about this program and this guy in Roxbury, Massachusetts, who ran he was blind as it happened, who ran a kind of anti-violence program. And there was a call, as I recall. Now, I can't remember how I knew about him. I know that I had worked in Roxbury as a student at Wellesley to try to get the first black person, Tom Atkins, elected to the school board, which had a very racist history, and its leader, Louise Day Hicks, was a horrible person, and you know, which we see subsequently with the integration of the Boston schools, and but in some ways, somehow I knew about this, and I guess Ernie knew about it too, because we hadn't communicated to each other. And there went a call went out to have people try to keep the peace. And in Boston, we knew that Washington, D.C. was aflame, Newark was aflame. There, you know, like
I think
Detroit, so many cities. And we were afraid that the police might kill people, you know, who might be rioting or looting. And so what got organized were people driving in their own cars, but we had like CB radios that would say, car X go to, you know, such and such a block. We hear that people are gathering. And, you know, we would say, you know, brothers and sisters, you know, the cops are coming. Let's just keep things under, you know, we don't want you all to get hurt. And, you know, I think we were largely successful. Boston didn't blow up. And so this was, you know, a part of a number of community efforts that were taking place. The community had, black communities in Boston had already been active in trying to change through voting what, you know, to get a black person on the first on the school board, then on the city council and other things. So there was a lot, and we had a professor, a sociology professor, that had black and white students working in both the black community in Boston and the Irish community in Boston. And you know, that was a very successful. So I'd done some surveys trying to ask people what they wanted, what they needed. So it wasn't just completely out of the picture that I would want to try to be a part of this. And I guess for Ernie, who you can ask, it wasn't out of the picture for him as well.
So then, just quickly, you finished your PhD. Did you teach at U of Michigan?
Yes, I did. But I hadn't finished my PhD yet. I did teach. I was an adjunct. When I first went there, I worked with the labor relations program at Michigan, and I got to know a lot of people in the labor community. Particularly, you know, Michigan is dominated by the auto workers, but other people. I got a small grant to run a program to have women. It was called No Crystal Stair, to have women who were veterans of both the union and different auto companies, to talk about what their experiences were as black women, both in the union and working in Ford and GM and other places. Also, just, you know, the first black teachers in Flint didn't get hired until the 1950s, which was just shocking to me, and to really look at how different communities in Michigan had developed. And so that was part of my interest, that later that I had already developed working on my dissertation, but really got I got a lot of interest and knowledge about working class union activists when I was at Michigan, and then I started teaching in African American studies as an adjunct. And when as I was finishing my PhD, I got a job at University of Michigan Flint, and then a job at Eastern Michigan University when I actually got finished. It took me forever, like 10 years to get the PhD, which we don't let our grad students do anymore. And I started teaching at Eastern Michigan. By that time, I had a second son, Rodney. And while I was at Eastern Michigan, I got a job offer from Maryland, which had been trying to recruit my husband for some time. And this is 1992. I got my PhD in 1988. And we and we decided to move back to the East Coast where Ernie is from. And our children, Malik was going into 10th grade and Rodney was going into 2nd grade, which I discovered were the 2 worst times to move, especially a boy. But we bought a home in Silver Spring, and which you've been to, and our kids started school, and I started working at University of Maryland.
Department of History?
African American Studies, which Maryland, as you know, has divisions. The college divisions are a little bit different from other places. So history is in arts and sciences, and African American Studies is in behavioral and social science, largely because Mary Frances Berry, who's a historian, and John Bracey, I think they were both at Maryland. And they started African American Studies, but Mary was dean of behavioral and social sciences, so it went into BSOS instead of arts.
And then after that, you came to University of Southern California.
Yes, but we were there. We were at Maryland for 15 years.
15 years, okay.
And then Ernie became dean of the Annenberg School.
At USC.
And I joined him and joined initially American Studies and Ethnicity. I'm still in that department, but I'm also in History and Gender and Sexuality Studies.
Wonderful. So my last question is, you have lived through the time of segregation, and now we are in 2022. And what would you say the situation is like today for young African Americans?
You know, I think it's quite mixed. I think for young working class African Americans, especially if they don't have a college education, it is very tough because the kinds of jobs that you could get in the 60s and the 50s pretty much don't exist. You could get a job in a plant and really make a decent living, enough to buy a house, to, you know, support your family. You know, you'd get medical care, you'd get a pension. And I'm thinking of my cousins who worked for McDonnell Douglas, and one event when McDonnell Douglas left St. Louis, one worked for one of the airlines. You know, they had really decent employment that was equal to what somebody with a college degree would have. Those jobs are pretty much gone. You know, the plant jobs at plants and other things. It's much harder to get those. So, you know, I think that is an issue. That it makes it harder. The jobs there. I don't remember as many drugs. Nobody thought people on heroin was a positive thing. And, you know, the way that drugs have flooded the community, I also think that there's a certain naivete even about college students that think there's still affirmative action. I think there's still a number of barriers to employment in California. It's so expensive to have a house, to have, you know, even rent is extraordinarily expensive. So I think that it's much tougher. I can remember Ernie and I moved to Berkeley. We literally lived for over a year on $500 a month. Now this was helped by my parents having given us a gas card. But our rent on Dwight Way in Berkeley was $175 a month. And we had this down to the penny. I mean, we were eating braised lamb necks, which, you know, we laugh about, you know, all these different cheap cuts and trying to make them better. Well, even if we think that that $500 is worth, in 1972 is worth maybe $5,000, you can't live on $5,000 in California, at least, a month. It's very, very difficult, and yet, you know, this is what teachers are making. You know, that's $60,000 a year. So I think it's very, I think for people living in major metropolitan areas, it's really tough. It's tough to be independent. And I also think that, you know, I don't know if the racial hatred was just simmering or what, but I think that it's much more open and even much more accepted. And so I think that, you know, when I see that people are just punching Asians, that you know, the pushing people onto subway tracks, you know, the mass shootings, I feel like we're at a point that it's hard to see without thinking that there'll be a broader concern by more people. You know, we're allowing ourselves to, as Americans, to be to have our gun laws and other things determined by a minority than a majority. It's illegal to use federal money to study gun violence. Well, that's crazy. And so when something happens, the people are saying, oh, well, we don't have any statistics on that. Well, we don't have statistics on it because it's illegal to do it. So some states, like California and a few other states, have started collecting their own data. But what, you know, like, we need to move beyond that. Most people feel that some of the things that have come about are ridiculous. And, you know, there's broad support for sensible gun laws. There's broad support for abortion rights. But all of these things are, you know, getting frayed. And, you know, the Clarence Thomas and the Supreme Court have signaled that the next thing is likely to be LGBT rights. And I just think this is very disturbing.
And again, thinking about before desegregation, the strong communities that African Americans had. Do you have thoughts about that?
Well, I think to some extent, because we had a very clear and obvious problems, you know, segregation, which meant in many cases schools, libraries, parks, cemeteries, jobs. Those were things that could unite people. And so other kinds of things that might be different class, other things, they were more subsumed. So I think some of the changes and what seems to be lack of cohesion are normal, because there have always been class differences and other kinds of things, not positive. Because I think that working class Black people are the people that really brought our communities together and were, you know, the moral centers of our communities. But you know, like if I look at Los Angeles, which I don't know as well, one of the things that happened is that many working class black people, as drugs flooded into South LA, they moved to the Inland Empire if they could. And so, you know, that's going to make the communities less cohesive because you lose people, you know, and changing immigration dynamics. So South Central, Compton, and all those places that fought to integrate are now largely either gentrifying or have become largely Latino. But so I think that I think that there is still a certain kind of cohesiveness. It's not always geographic. And we see this in Washington, D.C. as well. You know, certain areas are gentrifying, and certainly people in black communities feel that they feel a certain sense of loss, both territorial and community-wise, because of the way that gentrification. And also just displacement. People aren't always displaced in areas that are improving. So, you know, it's like here, you can sell a house for a lot, but where are you going to move? And so I think that I'm more worried about the racist climate and how that affects all Americans, the racist, homophobic, and also the anti-women, you know, climate, which really is affecting everybody, but it's going to hurt black women more, who already have the highest infant mortality rates, not only in the country but in the whole developing world, and so.
Is it 3 times higher, right? Is it?
I don't know the exact number, but
I think it's 3 times higher infant mortality among blacks.
And it's across income. I think they really think that it has to do with stress. So, in part, especially for upper income and access to good medical care. So, I'm worried. I do think, at the same time as a college professor, I see tremendous resilience and interest in the future among young people, black, white, Asian. And it's my hope. I'm always telling them, we messed up. It's up to you to set things straight again. You can.
How did you mess up?
Well, we didn't finish. I don't think we totally messed up, but I think some people felt, okay, these laws will protect us. We weren't completely vigilant, and we weren't, you know, some people got complacent. It doesn't matter whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. And, you know, we got somebody who, as a historian, seems to me to be like the rebirth of the Dixiecrats and the segregationists, and, you know, who changed what had been dog signals to just outright racist appeals. And I think, you know, and the fact that some of those things didn't say black people, but said, you know, Mexicans are racist. I think not enough black people just stood up and said, this is not right. You know, so. And
do you think your generation takes blame for that? For not keeping the vigilant?
I don't know. I think we're worried, and I think we're worried. And part of it is we did what we did so our children would grow up in a different kind of society. And they did, but then you say, should I warn them more about this? You know, that this could happen. And I don't know if Jewish people felt like that in Germany, you know, if they felt we should have told our children more about the ghettos and the racist kind of laws that kept Jews in ghettos. I mean, before like the Warsaw Ghetto or something, whether we should have, you know, become cosmopolitan, you know, and then were our children not alert? You know, did they not, you know, could they have moved faster? I mean, those are hypotheticals. You just don't know.
Sure.
But, you know, I mean, I think Trump is just the mouthpiece. But so, you know, the pushback started during the Civil Rights Movement. I think a lot of us did not realize, we thought, not that we didn't think there was a pushback, but we underestimated their long game. And, you know, so people have, you know, we left it to our children and our children's children to try to get things right again.